including our esteemed panelists. Today is a very interesting session prepared for all of you. I hope you'll enjoy it. And we welcome you to this panel discussion, which is a part of the Lahore Policy Exchange session on setting the agenda for climate development and resilience in Pakistan. This session today is jointly organized by the Consortium for Development Policy Research, the International Growth Center, and the World Bank. And now, before we begin, I want to apologize in advance for sounding like Winnie the Pooh at some points, but I woke up with a blocked nose, so forgive me for that. Now, hosting the session today is doubly important, not just because in Pakistan we live and breathe climate change on a daily basis, but also because the cyclone Biparjoy is expected to make landfall today, and maybe perhaps as we speak. Living with climate change-induced and/or exacerbated natural disasters has become routine for Pakistan, which necessitates that we talk with policy experts on energy, on agriculture, on urban planning, and of course on development and resilience. And to this effect, we have with us a very esteemed panel who will be discussing the nuances of climate change. Amongst our speakers is Mr. John Roome. John Roome is the South Asia Regional Director for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. Before that, he was Senior Director for Climate Change. His experience spans water, urban, transport, energy, rural, agriculture, environment, and social sectors, as well as disaster risk management and climate change. He was educated at Oxford University, where he obtained a master's degrees in econometrics and in management studies, and the University of Cape Town, where he obtained a bachelor's degree in economics, statistics, and actuarial sciences. Then we also have Dr. Muhammad Umar Masood, who is the CEO of the Urban Unit and has been a member of the Pakistan Administrative Service for 15 years. He completed his PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Urban and Regional Planning. Dr. Masood also holds a master's in public policy degree from Princeton University. We have joining us Ms. Amna Bajwa. Amna Bajwa is an economic policy professional with 15 years of experience in the public sector and development agencies. She possesses in-depth knowledge and rich expertise in agriculture, agribusiness sector and value chains, public sector governance and reform, and private sector development. Amna holds a master's in policy economics from Williams College. Then we have Mr. Rafe Alam. Rafe Alam is a Pakistani environmental lawyer and an activist. In 2013, after over a decade of practicing corporate and constitutional law, Rafe co-founded Salim Alam & Co., a firm that specializes in the energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sectors. Rafe regularly advises the federal and provincial governments, the World Bank, ADB, IFC, and a number of NGOs on issues of policy and strategy in these sectors. He holds a Bachelor of Law degree from SOAS, the University of London. Now, after that very expansive and impressive introduction, I'd like to begin today's session without further ado by calling Dr. Naved Hamid to please come and introduce the session.
Wanted to do was to give a bit of context for this event and all the activities that we are organizing. This year, IGC is going to focus on climate change. And as I was talking to John there, that are you getting traction on climate change from the government and other agencies? And we felt that while Pakistan has so many macroeconomic problems that not many people are focusing on this issue of climate change, and it is increasingly important to give it some kind of literally central stage in our development policies. So this year, what we are trying to do is to get the, we call it agenda setting in climate change, and get bigger audience, ownership, both in the government, but particularly in civil society, media, and these, so that we can get some discussion going on this, and also then what are the key areas to focus on, because it's a huge area, and therefore there is a need to identify what are the areas to start with. In this, We have primarily at the moment decided on that we'll have three broad themes or areas. One would be on resilient cities. Uh, what do cities need to do to prepare for what is going to coming forward in terms of climate change, flooding, and all the other heat waves and all stuff that may be on the horizon. And we had a very nice session with Omar on this subject. And so that's one area. The other area is energy, and energy has various dimensions in uh, both in terms of its affordability, accessibility, as well as how to sort of reduce consumption in terms of energy, in terms by promoting efficiency and a better, greater consciousness amongst the users of energy to be more conscious with regards to that. And the third one is on agriculture. Now, agriculture is an area which we've just started to work on and trying to identify what should be the areas of focus. But clearly, in some ways, it's a sector which is going to be very directly influenced by climate change. Uh, but we still have to figure out where to focus on, because it's such a large sector that if we try to sort out all the problems of the agriculture sector, then we hardly get anywhere. So we're going to come at it from the climate change angle and what we need to do. So that's the broad area. And this is one of the earlier events in this agenda setting framework. We hope to do more policy work on this, have some briefs, discussions, and then workshops, etc. So this is probably the first or the second event to public event to kick this off. And I have not introduced John because the JARS wanted to do that, so I'll leave it to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Naveed, who is the Resident Director of IGC and a board member, CTPR. All right, so we'll be coming back to Dr. Ijaz, perhaps at the end of Mr. John Roome's presentation. But to begin, so the World Bank has recently launched the Country Climate and Development Report, the CCDR for Pakistan. This focuses on key findings and recommendations to integrate resilience with development planning and investment while maximizing opportunities for emissions reduction. One of the leading champions of the CCDR himself, Mr. John Roome, will present the key messages and recommendations of the report, and together with the panel and the audience today, explore the constraints that have prevented Pakistan from achieving this climate development convergence so far. May I please request Mr. John Roome to take the next 15 minutes to present on the key findings of the Country Climate and Development Report, and maybe also briefly touch upon what he thinks the expected outcome of the panel discussion today should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I stand, can you still hear me? Yeah, that's better. Sorry, I can just put it here, it should be fine. Hello? Yeah. Yeah, I flew over the weekend and I'm at that stage where the jet lag starts to kick in. And to be honest, if I'm standing, I can keep the jet lag at bay. So thank you very much. So we're talking about CCDRs. Thank you very much for hosting this event. It's a great opportunity. I've probably done 30 of these events on the Pakistan one alone since we launched it. A key part of this is actually to have some discussion. But by way of background, the bank has done about 30 or 35 of these CCDRs at the moment. We're trying to roll them out across all countries. In South Asia, we have completed Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. India is underway. It's been delayed a little bit because they're very focused on the G20 at the moment, and so they're going to need a little bit of time for us to work a little bit more on that. And I've kicked off Maldives and Sri Lanka in the last month. The basic idea behind the CCDRs is to have a look at the convergence of development and climate change. There's a lot of discussion about climate change. This brings the convergence together because in our views, you'll see from this presentation, you can't treat climate change separately from development. They are inexorably pulled together. And the approach we've taken in each country is to say, what are the development opportunities and challenges in each country from a development perspective, and how can a country develop best in the face of climate change? In most of the developing countries that we're dealing with, that means dealing with resilience, but in many of them, there is an emissions element to that as well, emissions reduction, depending on the size of the emissions pattern, and I'll come to that later. So how do countries make priorities in this? So I'm going to have to try and figure out how to make this work. Okay, so let me try and find, maybe if I stand on the other side, it might be easier for me. Where can I stand to see this? You're going to want to get me in the thing as well, so maybe I should have figured this out beforehand. Maybe if I stand there, you can get both. That's a pretty good idea. Okay. But I need to be off to the side. Yeah, okay, that works well. So most of you in Pakistan know this picture very well. If you look on the right-hand side, Pakistan has seen a reduction in poverty, extreme poverty, largely driven by off-farm economic activity and foreign remittances. And you can see a very positive chart on the right-hand side. However, growth per capita in GDP has been volatile and lower than comparators. And underlying a lot of this are a number of deep structural issues that all of you know very well. The circular debt, including around energy, large and unproductive subsidy regimes that drive a lot of the things that we are seeing. Fundamentally, and I'll come back to this later, is the very low level of tax collection in Pakistan. Pakistan is around 10% of GDP in terms of tax collection. Comparable countries, 18, 19, 20% at least. When you're only at 10% tax collection and you want to try and manage your deficit, maybe you can go to 14% investment. Those public investment levels then become very low with the expenditure levels. So basically, you're seeing a pattern over here where you've had constrained investment that's then resulted in constrained investments in human capital, including policies that have not driven human capital as well as they could, which has further constrained some of the things we've seen, a lack of basic infrastructure and services. So this is the context within which we're looking at opportunities for Pakistan to grow to the next level. In this environment, Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And you can see the climate risk. It's one of the dark countries. You can argue what number it is, but it's in one of the most vulnerable countries. A lot of this comes from variation in rainfall, cyclones coming in with an alternating flood and drought mechanism, changes in the pattern of rainfall, and in changes in heat, extreme heat, which then channel themselves largely through agriculture, but also through damages from the floods. We've then mapped and tried to manage under different climate scenarios, what might this impact of climate change be on GDP? And you're seeing it in the range of 18 to 20%, coming from, as I said, high temperatures and floods, water insecurity, and what we've added in there is the impact of air pollution. Air pollution is related, just a quick background on air pollution. If a country like Pakistan were able to meet the global standards on air pollution, you'd have a significant reduction in mortality, in deaths, and you'd have a growth in GDP, and 50% of the actions that are needed to reduce that air pollution will also reduce emissions. So there's a strong set of co-benefits. You can argue about how you calculate it, that's why we spread it out separately, but you can see the significant damage that we see there. From an emissions perspective, we have to be honest. Pakistan has contributed less than 1% of total greenhouse gas emissions, so it's not a historic part of the problem, even though it's suffering from climate change. The emissions per capita are low, about 1/3 of the global averages. So even on a per capita basis, it's low. However, emissions per GDP unit are higher than the global average, largely because of the structure of the economy, but they are declining at more or less the same speed on a proportional basis as the global emissions. A lot of this is coming out of the energy sector, as you can see here in terms of growth, but there are some other sectors, energy and transport being the biggest part of that. Given this pattern as it comes together, the key recommendation on this is that Pakistan first focuses on resilience, which we've talked about before, second on reducing emissions, and within the reducing emissions bucket to focus first on those that are in Pakistan's interest because it reduces air pollution or because it gives you better energy security, and then move on to the other issues. If you talk about bigger countries like China or India that are global movers of global emissions, you open up another set of issues, including in my country, South Africa, in terms of how you incentivize that further action. In terms of this global analysis, Pakistan will eventually become material, but it's not the major burning issue at this point in time. We're already seeing the impacts of the floods. We saw 2022, 1/3 of the country underwater, 1,700, 33 million people affected, $16 billion of damage. This comes from the PDNA that we have done. But remember, in that year, people have almost forgotten about it. There was an unprecedented heat wave just before, with temperatures that are crossing into that range where it is not only reducing productivity, but becoming a major health issue. And so again, from the PDNA, looking at this 2022 floods, 9 million people pushed into poverty, 6 to 7 million people falling further behind, increased food security, women at greater risk of preventable diseases, job losses. You can see the numbers there. But let's also remember that, okay, these are numbers. Behind each one of these numbers is a person. We were just in Sindh, in a village outside Hyderabad, and just hearing these women talking about the stories of what happened on the flood makes it very personal, very different. So a number of women talked about a very similar story. So 35, 40-year-old woman, 5 or 6 children already. The girl children don't go to school because there's no access to the school. They maybe earn $1 a day picking cotton when they can get the job. There's no healthcare, so they're extremely vulnerable. They live in mud huts. The flood comes. They watch the flooding coming. They're up to here in water. They're up to here in water. They then need to save their kids to go and live on the side of the road for 2 months. They can't save their cattle because they can't bring it. Their cattle die. They come back. House is gone. Livelihood is gone. Food savings are gone. Crops are gone. They have got no access to it. So you have a situation where people are not only harmed by climate change, but they're starting from a very vulnerable position. And coming back to it later, I'll come back in. If they had stronger development, it would have built that resilience. So there is a correlation between the core underlying lack of resilience, lack of human capital, lack of access to services, and vulnerability to climate in terms of how it hits you. But looking forward, coming out of this flood, there was this Triple R program that talked about building back better with an idea of having inclusive resilience recovery for the whole of Pakistan to lead to sustainable development, focusing on restoration of jobs and livelihoods, reconstruction of the assets, and strengthening governance for reconstruction in communities with a focus on building back better. When we looked at the CCDR, the core message is that Pakistan can continue to develop in a resilient way and in a way that meets its NDC commitments on emissions if it focuses on 3 priority areas and 2 enablers. The 3 priority areas are transferring the agriculture, food, and water system. Second one, building resilience and livable cities. Third one, accelerating a just transition in energy and transport. But to underpin that, there needs to be strengthening of human capital, see the comment that I had before, and aligning policies and institutions and financing. And you'll notice a lot of this aligned very closely with what you said. So let's look at the first one, transforming the agriculture and food system. As you all know, agriculture is still a fundamental part of the economy in terms of GDP. There's a large number of people that survive from the agriculture sector, and a much higher proportion of poor people. But the agriculture system in Pakistan is punching way below its weight. Okay, if you look at yields compared to global best practices are sometimes 2, sometimes 5 times higher than they are in Pakistan. Access to market is lower in terms of the value added. Whatever measure you take, productivity per drop of water, on all of these measures, Pakistan is way below comparatives, even though it's an important sector. On top of this, you then look, climate change comes along, and this could add reductions in yields of up to 50%, which poses major threats on top of this. So what can be done in order to address this? First one, supporting climate smart and regenerative agriculture. There are a lot of things that can be done in terms of changing the crops that are used. Okay, we're moving away from water-hungry crops to less water-hungry crops. Secondly, moving in certain products to heat-resistant and different water-resistant crops that are able to cope under different water regimes. Moving to higher value-added and reduced food loss and waste also builds resilience in the sector, which means access to market, better value added, better productive, better incomes. Moving to climate smart agriculture in this way can increase rates of return and incomes for poor people and build climate resilience. And there's a whole bunch of recommendations that are in the report on this. The second one, and a critical one, is modernizing and improving irrigation and drainage in Pakistan. Pakistan has this great history of the Indus River system of irrigation. It did a great job for the 1950s and 1960s. But let's be honest, it is not fit for purpose for the 2030s and the 2040s. This was designed as a system essentially to flood water into large amounts of agricultural land, given the cropping pattern at that time. You don't have the water or the capability to do this, and it doesn't support the kind of agriculture you're going to need in the future. So this agriculture, this irrigation system is going to have to be completely modernized to allow for drainage of water, to deal with the problems of waterlogging and salinity at the same time, to deal with the hill torrents, and to manage this water in a way that you allocate it more efficiently to different kinds of agriculture and also to the cities that are going to take it out. So this has got to be completely modernized. If we're going to have this water system support this, there needs to be ecosystem and landscape management to reduce the impacts of hill torrents in order to protect the quality of the upstream water. And in many cases, when you come back to climate smart agriculture, once you throw livestock in there, how you manage your livestock is absolutely critical. However, underpinning all of this comes to the first point that I meant here, is a recommendation of repurposing subsidies and using money most effectively. If you add up the total amount of agriculture and fertilizer subsidies in Pakistan, you're probably approaching about $3 billion a year, depending on what you call it. That's a huge amount of money, and it dwarfs the investments that are made in infrastructure and R&D and other development of the agriculture system. So by repurposing these subsidies to support the poor, access to markets, and climate resilience, to support these things, you can meet these objectives and ensure that this subsidy is used more effectively. And just to be very clear here, this is not an ideological anti-subsidy point. It's not saying you have to take the subsidies out of agriculture. This is not a macroeconomic IMF argument. It's basically saying take the money that you have and deploy your public expenditure in a way that meets these objectives and your objectives of serving the poor. Second big block is building resilient and livable cities. There are a significant number of people living in cities in Pakistan at the moment. It is increasing with fairly rapid urbanization that's taking place in a rather disorganized way. And to be nice about it, Pakistan's cities are not the most livable cities in the world. They're not cities with high degrees of services, and they're not conducive to competitive businesses and jobs. There are a lot of difficulties in these cities. If cities can be designed, planned, and managed in a way that will allow for more efficient delivery of services and competitiveness, you can both get the growth, and if you plan cities well to make them more compact rather than more spread out, you can reduce emissions. And if you think about the patterns of flooding you're going to have, you can reduce the impacts of floods on what's happening. So what are the blocks? One is this urban planning and management capability. Underpinning all of this, cities need access to own resources and funding to do it. You need strengthened planning capability. Second one is green urban mobility. In order to allow mobility to take place, this is not just a question of giving everybody a Tesla. Okay, the question is, how do you have a transport system that has more public transport? So we reduce the number of people on the road, that we reduce the need for transport through better urban transport. Then with the fleet that you need at the end, starting with the public buses and the trikes and three-wheelers and things like this, focus on how you reduce the emissions from that. That's what we mean by green urban mobility. Climate smart municipal services and circularity. Just take one example, solid waste management. Solid waste management is a real problem, and it's a double problem from a climate perspective. A lot of that solid waste ends up blocking drains and making flooding worse, and it releases all sorts of methane if not well managed. So finding ways of managing this better can, again, give you this triple win: better livable city, greater resilience, and lower emissions. Underpinning this, as I come back to later, is a need to raise greater revenue. The amount of revenue managed by cities is very low in Pakistan, and the revenue that's being raised. I'll come back to that later. Third one is accelerating the transition in energy and transport. Again, we all know, you know better than any of us, the challenges on the energy sector. Lack of reliability, high prices, negative impact on the macro, both through the importation and the circular debt problem that has happened. A lot of those issues are going to have to be addressed as they go forward. But a key opportunity lies in the transition away from fossil fuels. We've now moved to a situation where renewable energy is on a par or cheaper, and certainly quicker to put in place than fossil fuel-based energy, and it reduces your dependence on imports, so it gives you an energy security. But it's not just the supply side issue, it's also a question of the supply side efficiency in terms of losses through the network, demand side efficiency, because this is seen as the first renewable fuel. If you can reduce demand for electricity through better building structures, better use of energy in industry, by reducing the demand, again, you get the economic benefits and you reduce the carbon emissions. There's a key element here for reducing emissions in industry and transport, and then ensuring that this is a just transition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. And also remember that agriculture has a huge potential contribution to Pakistan's NDC commitments. If Pakistan can reform agriculture the way it's talked about, methane emissions can contribute very significantly to Pakistan's NDC commitments. Strengthening human capital. Okay, so come back to that example of the women that I talked about. Okay, if her girls were getting educated, if they were healthy, and they had an opportunity to move, the resilience that they have to floods and shocks is much higher, and they have options to move out of difficult areas. But there are a few other areas, 3 other specific human capital areas that are specifically related, surprisingly, to climate change. The first one is to reduce stunting. Stunting is very high in Pakistan. That then results in poor health outcomes for young people, poor outcomes on education, poor outcomes in later life, lower degrees of resilience that I've talked about earlier. Second one, reducing fertility. If Pakistan could shift its fertility rates just to the South Asian level, by 2050, I think it is, there'll be 30 million people less than in the other case in Pakistan. That reduces emissions, reduces the demand on water, reduces the demand on agriculture, increases the ability to be resilient. And the third one is to build a shock responsive social protection system. There is a social protection system here. Coverage is not universal at the moment. And if you could put this social protection system so it could respond even quicker than it does now, or even in advance of floods, it was a key part of building this resilience. So as you go through all of those recommendations, and they're spelled out in the report, I've only touched on them, almost all of them are economic win-wins. They have an economic rate of return that is well above the norm that you need, and clearly the benefits exceed the cost. So they make a lot of sense. What's the problem? The challenge primarily comes down to one of financing on the investment side. And you can see the investment costs estimated about $350 billion up to 2030. It's many multiples of the level of investment that's taking place now. Part of the challenge is that these investments in climate, be it in renewable energy or in resilience, have the characteristic of upfront costs with benefits later. And so this creates an even stronger financing challenge. So what to do about it? And these recommendations come in 3 blocks, or 2 big blocks with 3 blocks in this. First one is how to maximize the financing that can go into these kinds of activities. Public sector. As I talked about before, there is an opportunity to increase revenue mobilization. Property taxes, extremely low in Pakistan at the moment, huge opportunity to increase them and channel that money to local authorities. There's an opportunity for a carbon tax of some form. A carbon tax, for those of the economists, is a PIGU tax. Okay, a tax is bad, not good. It's relatively easy to collect. It's an opportunity to raise more revenue. And it's not like the Pakistani system is overtaxed. That tax number has got to go up from 10% to like, there's no way around it. So increasing public revenue. Secondly, as I talked about, there is a need for repurposing of subsidies and rethinking subsidies and expenditure in order to move of where this is going to come. Coming back to this then, the second block is even if you do all of this, this is not going to generate enough money to finance that. So further prioritization of the investment program is going to be absolutely critical, and building a financing strategy realistically around that. So then how do you put the institutions in place to do it? And there's recommendations here. And I was talking to our team. These are the recommendations that we came up. Systematic metrics and reporting on climate actions, climate risk screening for financial management, implementing a disaster resilience framework, institutional regulatory framework for international finance. All of these are good recommendations that we stand by. But as I've gone through the many times where we've discussed this and presented it, it's occurred to me that as I go through all of these recommendations, I'm sure many of you recognize this. There's not a lot of new things here. Maybe you haven't seen them packaged in this packaging, but we've been talking about agriculture reform, the need to reform the Indus cities for a long period of time. There is a consensus, or pretty close to a consensus, that most of these things are good things to do, but the political economy, for various reasons, get in the way. It's a question of phasing, it's a question of vested interests, it's a question of elite capture, it's a question of a whole bunch of political economy things. And in the end, I think one of the key points that we're making through this is that Pakistani society, public sector, private sector, civil society, needs to make a decision. Are you going to find some way to break through the political economy that seems to be trapping Pakistan in this area? We can talk about what we can do as the World Bank to help it, but in the end, it has to be a homegrown way of dealing with this political economy. I don't mean to sound condescending here, but I think this is the reality, and this is why I think this sort of discussion is absolutely critical going forward. So some questions. How does Pakistan prioritize these transitions we've talked about? There are some tough decisions that are going to be made, and they're going to have to be made by Pakistanis at different levels. What are the enablers to make this happen? What are the different roles of different partners in order to... All of these solutions are multi-sector solutions and multi-player solutions. If you think about agriculture transition, energy transition, cities, there's no one actor that holds the silver bullet, the magic wand that's going to make it happen. People are going to have to come together in order to address it. And then A sub-issue that's particularly interesting in Pakistan is how to manage the role of the national federal versus the provincial, because you've got these split responsibilities. How do we coordinate these? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John Roome. That was very informative. I think for all of those who work in the climate change domain, we can vouch that the absence of updated, reliable data is one of the greatest impediments to producing policy work that can actually help the country. And so this report will be of great benefit to all of us. Mr. Roome has identified 3 priority areas in the CCDR, which are agriculture and food systems, the resilient and livable cities, and transport and energy. We have with us panelists who will effectively talk about all 3 of these areas. Will Dr. Ijaz? And before we begin and move on to the question and to asking the panelists our questions, we will be joined very briefly by Dr. Ijaz, who wants to say a few words.
Okay. It's next to the mic, so people can hear me also. Okay. So thank you very much, John. This has been a fantastic summary of an excellent report, and I'm really sorry I'm not there to attend this in person, and technology isn't serving us very well today. You know, John and I have known each other for a long time in the working together in the Asia World Bank. And it's really terrific that John is now working on South Asia, because he brings a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience, very valuable experience in Pakistan. So this is fantastic to have him work on South Asia. John, I just want to share with a couple of points. One is that what we are trying to do in this agenda year is actually to take the issue of climate change to a much larger audience than just the government. Government, of course, extremely important, but we felt that we need to raise awareness in order to have a broad own about the likely impact of climate change and how we should begin to respond to that. And therefore, much of what we will be doing this year will be to reach out to that larger set of stakeholders beyond the government, the media, the researchers, the NGO community in Pakistan, which is very research community. So our approach this year is going to be to reach this or to cultivate deeper ownership reform. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other, John, is, and this is something that we've been working on and thinking about since we started the agenda setting year. The World Bank report is excellent. We have some work done by the IGC. Between that and the World Bank report, we have a lot of very good insights on exactly what you talked about, which is, climate development from the climate change agenda and thereby, rejuvenate the reform that's needed to have good. But however, as you said in your concluding comments, the political economy of reform is extremely complex. And the political economy is not just about reducing subsidies, it is really about distributing subsidies. So even if we can withstand the pressure of the IMF in not reducing the overall subsidy, the real issue is really how we distribute that subsidy and this cuts across the board, whether it's culture or energy or any. It's the political economy of reform is really complex. Same thing with irrigation, land distribution. Land ownership patterns have a lot to do with how the irrigation system is being run to the ground, and therefore reform will need to address all that. So, given the complexity, and it's not that this is the first time we're talking about the need for reform in these areas. World Bank, the IMF, research community, we've been talking about reform for a long time along these lines. The question is, how do we use this phenomena of climate change and what it will do to people's lives to get the interest in to get traction on some of this reform? And we thought that sequencing is going to be extremely important. We first need to reach out to the general public to make aware of the ways in which climate change is going to affect people's lives. Get that point across so that people understand that things will change in a very fundamental way to adjust to climate change. And then talk about the whole development agenda, because maybe it'll pry open the complex political economy issues once the message of the likely impact of climate change is going to be on the crop on people's livelihoods, etc. So it's a question of sequencing. Do we take the whole development agenda up front, or do we spend the first maybe year or so just talking about the way in which climate change is going to affect us? So this is something we've been struggling with, and it'll be great to have this considered during the discussion.
Thank you. We would now like to move on to our first round of questions. There's no set order, but I'll start with Dr. Umar, then I'll speak with Ms. Amna, and then Rafi Alam. And in the end, I'd also like to ask Mr. Roome a few questions. I'd request each speaker to please keep their answers brief and to about 5 minutes. At about 4 minutes, 30 seconds, I'll start coughing to indicate. And for the audience, please don't interrupt the speakers. We have plenty of time at the end of the session to take on your questions. Now, Dr. Umar, the need for creating livable and resilient cities really can't be stressed enough, especially now that we've seen floods and we're seeing cyclones come. So my question for you is, how can the implementation of improved land use planning, coupled with the adoption of nature-based solutions and cutting-edge technologies, contribute in creating more sustainable, resilient cities and achieving significant reductions in emissions? And how can Pakistan kickstart this?
Thank you. So I'll answer it very differently. I'll tell you a story what I've been doing for the last 4 weeks. I was on mandatory government training, and I think Rafi was also one of the guest speakers. We were to develop policy papers on climate change related issues. So I had a policy paper on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transport for the city of Lahore. Now, the first reactions when we presented the policy paper this afternoon was, your recommendations are too broad. They look very general. Let's talk about Lahore. Let's talk about what you are proposing about Lahore. And that is one of the greater challenges when we talk about climate change and resilient city, is that we know the impact of climate change on cities, but when it comes to our cities, we do not have either the data or we do not have the empowered structure in the city, euphemism for a well-functioning local government. Because of that, we are in a very gray area in which provincial level civil servants or federal level civil servants are trying to propose solutions for resilient cities. Now, coming to land use planning, this was really interesting. So one of our recommendations was that people really need to switch to public mass transit, and that would significantly, over a period of time, reduce greenhouse gas emission. The city has to be more compact and everything. Uh, the orange line, for example, if you map it over the density cells or the density of Lahore, the orange line passes through the most densest portions of Lahore if possible. So in terms of alignment, I think in terms of providing opportunities for public transit, it is a great alignment. But what we are really missing is that the land use planning around it has to be of a specific nature that it creates opportunities for that greater volume so that that system could run. So there is a finance and a costing question to it also. Why it has not happened is that you have the transport department which is looking after the orange line. You have the Lahore Development Authority and the municipal corporation which is looking at land use planning. You have a third party which is an external consultant which is actually doing the land use plan and doing the master planning of it. And then you have the climate change or the environment protection department which has just been added a new suffix to it, which is environment protection and climate change department. They have to look at the climate implications of it. So our issue is, and I would slightly differ from Ijaz over here, and we bring the political economy questions too soon. I think we need to wait a little, and push with the problem and move forward before we cross the bridge of the political economy, because everything looks like a political economy. But what is stopping a group of people in a coordinated way to do a transit oriented development plan for the orange line so that maximum people can enjoy ridership? They can switch away from motorbikes or motor cars, and it can actually make Lahore a city according to global expectations. Your metro bus, which is now more than a decade old, data really now shows that it has significantly reduced greenhouse gas emission in that particular corridor. It has. What it really needs is the land use planning around the corridor to even intensify that use. So if you look at the city of Lahore, there are already things happening on the ground that we did not, start from square one. Another interesting factoid, and this was totally mind-blowing in our policy paper. We looked at a 1991 research by JICA on a comprehensive transport system in Lahore. And you know what JICA had recommended? That the railway tracks which run through Lahore can be actually retrofitted or upgraded to be the public transit system for Lahore. We don't notice those railway tracks now because they are so much encroached upon, you don't see the gauge. But at that time in 91, you could actually figure out that you are actually approaching a railway track. But now your car actually crosses over it and you don't figure out that there is a gauge. So, when it comes to resilient cities, I don't think so that all hope is lost. There are building blocks which need to be connected together. I would also advocate that we as Pakistanis spend a lot of time discussing the symptoms of climate change. And we do a great job in making different iterations of that presentation. And it was really a breath of fresh air. Just last minute entry was his climate change report. Somebody gave it to me last night while I was, brushing up on the paper. uh, there is a sense of urgency. When you read it, it's not that we are just trying to describe a problem which is around the corner. It is already a problem which is already existing, and there is a certain sense of urgency. I would go even further in that. I would say that we have come to a stage where we should be asking ourselves as a community, what should we do about it? Because this is the question which the world is asking us. I mean, we can run that story of we are contributing only 1% and we are not responsible for it. But it's like if the house is on fire, you are not. I mean, you're not trying to sort of extinguish the fire because you said that I did not lit the match. So that's a really poor analogy that we are trying to advocate, and I think a lot of our time at an advocacy level is sort of wasted in that. And coming to
Dr.
communication
Saab,
strategy.
I must interrupt. I'm
Sorry.
so sorry. But excellent points, and I would love to come back to a few of them, including how we can increase cohesion between government departments, because we face a lot of problems with that. But quickly jumping on to Ms. Amna. Amna, can I ask you to please elaborate on what policymakers can do to enable small farmers to adopt sustainable agricultural practices?
Thank you, Sarah. Let's talk briefly about what are the sustainable agriculture practices. Some of them Mr. John briefly touched upon. But we basically, when we talk about resilient systems, we talk about achieving the targeted yields while efficiently using the resources. So land is a resource, humans are also resources. By minimizing environmental impacts and also being resilient to external shocks. Right now, our agriculture systems do not account for these shocks. Our soils are degrading, we are depleting our water, food is being contaminated, we're also losing our biodiversity. And with agriculture, so it's a two-way game. So agriculture contributes to emissions within Pakistan. It's the second highest emitting sector, contributes to about 45%. Within agriculture, it's livestock and also rice farming that nobody talks about enough. But on the other hand, agriculture is also, it suffers the most from external shocks. And we've seen that in the recent floods. Similarly, one of the recent shocks that you talked about is the cyclone that may hit us. Latest estimates tell us that locust is a threat because of this, because swarms from Yemen and Saudi Arabia are being pushed through these strong winds towards the coastal areas of Pakistan. So extremely vulnerable, yet we don't talk much about it. Now you asked on how can we enable the smallholder farmers to adopt sustainable practices. We all know that smallholder farmers, 90% of the farmers in Pakistan are small, that is, they own land less than 12.5 acres. Yet, they also contribute towards almost 1/4 of GDP, given the limited resources that we provide them. By we, I meant the government, the public sector. So we can't really blame the farmers at all times, but we can blame the policy choices of the government. So ideally, governments need to provide enabling environment for the private sector to invest and to grow. But government loves to play the role of being a private sector, and they love to, be into the business of business. I'll just give you an example. Mr. John talked about the circular debt. So let's start with that in agriculture, which is not talked about. So the government, for example, we'll talk about wheat. It provides a support price to the farmers. In other commodities, for example, in cotton, we provide an indicative price. What do? We procure from the farmers and then we store. Now, storage has a cost. Transporting has a cost. Operations has a cost. Then we set a release price of wheat. So that price is for the private sector to buy wheat from you. Now, this price is often lower than our total cost. So one, that's a hit for us. Then we give this support prices for all farmers. So if I'm a farmer owning 200 acres of land, I really don't need this subsidy, but I get it, and the government pays for it. So the government, how does it pay for it? It borrows from banks and pays interest, and this is where debt comes in. So this is the circular debt in the wheat market. In Punjab alone, in one of the estimates, about 300 billion rupees are spent. According to this World Bank report, about $450 million are spent in the entire wheat procurement and wheat operations just in Punjab. So you can imagine the extent of it. But the issue is we don't even stop here. We intervene further. We put a ban on intra-provincial movements of our commodities, which means we are distorting the markets further. We also then put a price cap on, for example, roti, meat, and milk. So we push the farmer not to diversify, and then we also push the farmer not to compromise on quality of things. So this is what the government does. Now, in order to fix this, first of all, the government needs to align its policies and implement them. So again, Dr. Saab said that Pakistan, there's no dearth of documents, policies, frameworks. We have vision documents. Why are they not being implemented? On the other side, we have international commitments. NDCs is the most relevant one for today's session. But you look at the IMF conditionalities, they also sort of make sense. What do they say? They say you move from untargeted towards targeted subsidies. Now, just as an example, the government of Pakistan provides 30 billion rupees worth of subsidy to fertilizer companies. And then it provides an additional 6 billion subsidy for these companies to import urea. Now, when you talk about urea versus DAP, urea is more harmful to the environment than DAP. Yet, we are subsidizing them. We could reappropriate this money and provide targeted subsidies to farmers. I'll give you another.
Hi, Amna. I'm sorry. I know you've spoken about the gaps and the loopholes and why our current policies are failing, but maybe I can come back to you on how we can get sustainable practices going for farmers next time. Rafi, can I please take 5 minutes of your time? Right, so my question for you is, what factors are holding back the transition from fossil fuels to renewable sources? The sources of climate change and environmental pollution are primarily the same, that is, emissions that cause global warming and impact on air quality. Do you think it makes sense to address them separately, or should they be tackled jointly?
Thank you. And thank you, CDPR, for, again, Dr. Naved, addressing the climate crisis. And I must say, to start off with, before I get to your question, Sarah, is that I think in order to underline the status of the emergency, it should be referred to as the climate crisis. It's not something that's going to happen. There's a cyclone hitting land in Karachi, near Karachi today, and we suffered an unprecedented flood and heat waves last year, and air pollution are costing people in our cities anywhere between 2 to 8 years of their lives. So it's not something that's going to happen. People are suffering and dying because of this now. Now, the energy system of Pakistan and its mix is based on a hard grid that was designed and built from the 1920s and 30s onwards. It's a very old grid system. It's based on circles. And it's designed, like all major energy systems, to bring electricity to cities. Our major source or demand for electricity is in our cities. And the only way we can get that large amount of electricity to cities is by having very large power plants, which, if they're thermal power plants, can't be anywhere near a city because of the emissions they contain. And many of the, what was renewable, the hydel plants are often, just by virtue of geography, miles and miles away from where major cities are. And so we have a system, therefore, of large energy generation, transmission, then distribution. And that's the grid on which the energy system operates. And from my experience when I was on the board of LESCO itself had 23,000 linesmen just in the 5 districts it operates in around Lahore. Most linesmen make more money than I do. So if you're thinking that, a renewable energy system is just going to plop in and replace the grid, you have to understand that there are literally thousands of people and their interests supporting a pre-existing, inefficient, and often corrupt system. So while renewable energy is cheaper, this is solar and wind, is cheaper than all other forms of electricity available in Pakistan today, one of the major reasons why the transition isn't happening as it should the market forces not operating is because of what you can call euphemistically political economy. But I would sum it up by saying the Stone Age didn't come to an end because we ran out of stones. It wasn't also good ideas. You have to push people with again, more solid political economy. I remember, and I don't know if Dr. Nabi is listening, but I think it was 2016 or 17. The executive director of the bank was in Lahore. There was a lunch I attended, and the director was talking about how Pakistan had surprised all pundits by posting, I think, either 6 or 8 quarters of successive growth. That was in 2015-16. Look where we are now. What happened in between that would stop our democratic institutions from doing what they were supposed to do? Euphemistically political economy? I'll be more direct. Stop interfering with the democratic process. I just wanted to address one thing John and Amna were talking about in terms of farming. And that's the thrust on making sure we get food security. And Pakistan is food insecure. There was a report that came out, a newspaper article about 3 weeks ago, suggesting that Pakistan is already food insecure, mostly on account of the flooding that took place last year. And what we had in Punjab just a few months ago in response to this food insecurity, and the thrust of providing food security is making sure you have the small farmer is better prepared and better equipped to deal with challenges that he faces. But what did we see in Punjab? We saw the interim government attempting to hand over 1 million acres of land to the army for corporate farming. Again, stop interfering with the democratic processes. That's how you're messing up with the political economy, and these distortions in the political economy that aren't allowing us to move from the Stone Age into bigger, better, cheaper, more efficient, better air quality futures. Thank you.
Thanks, Rafi, and thanks for staying within your 5 minutes. Excellent job. I am going to come back to you in the next round of questions and ask how we can move out of the Stone Age in Pakistan effectively. Mr. John Roome, may I please ask you to elaborate on what the World Bank is planning to do to create, in regards creating a coalition, including with the government, private sector, civil society organizations, and the academia, to drive the implementation of climate transitions outlined in the CCDR in a coordinated manner for impact. And also, if I can ask from a personal perspective, every time we try to do any climate change related work, the first answer we get is, oh, but Pakistan doesn't have money for this. So if you could please address it from that angle, and how we can convince the government, the civil society organizations, that yes, we have money to use for climate change. Thank you.
And all in 5 minutes? So, but before I do that, I just want to correct an omission I made at the beginning. This report is the product of about 120 people in the World Bank working on it, and a lot of others. And Abid Khalil and Lisa Lang were two of the key stalwarts that drove it, a number of others, but they were part of the core team that, in fact, they were the part that made it happen in various capacities. So thank you very much to them. The first piece I would say is that if the expectation is that it's going to have to be the World Bank that puts this coalition together, we've got a problem in the first place. And so the first piece, I think, has got to be how can we support Pakistan coming together in a coalition? As I think you heard me say, this is going to require a coalition in order to make it happen. I like to use the analogy of burning platforms and a ladder. So the first thing is, we are sitting on a burning platform. And I think everybody has to be aware that this platform is burning, and if you don't take an action, you're going to collapse. And if some people sitting on that platform think we're fine, and it's made out of stainless steel or concrete or something is not going to collapse and others do, they're not going to work together to try and address it. And so being clear on what the dangers are of the status quo and spelling out very clearly using our comparative advantage. So that's why we talk about GDP, lives lost. You didn't hear me talking about RPC 7.3 and cyclone and all the rest of it, okay? We spent a lot of effort translating the science into economic and day-to-day stuff. So number one, make people aware of what that burning platform looks like. The second piece is that I don't think people act only out of fear and bad news. Often there's a lot of research that people respond much better to opportunity than to threat. So if you're sitting on a burning platform, can we be clearer on articulating what the new, better platform is that you jump to? I'm not convinced that only saying climate is a bad thing is what's going to stimulate the action. We have to be able to explain that actually there are opportunities here. That's why I talk about agriculture with a win-win to help farmers in a way that's climate smart, reducing food loss and waste, changing your crops, makes it better. So spelling out and trying to build a consensus. And then once you've got a sense of that, what is the ladder that gets you from the burning platform to the better platform? Okay, what are the steps that get there? And I think what we can do is a few things. One is we can share international experiences. We can explain how the pieces come together. We can sometimes, on some issues, be a convening neutral party, but I recognize there are some issues where, frankly, we don't have the credibility to do that, and that has to be done domestically. And then we can offer support on a policy basis and on a financing basis. And so as we think about how we use our financing, we've been thinking, one, about in the future, how do we support more systemic change at the country level? The second issue is how do we use our public financing to crowd in private financing in order to try and drive this agenda? And how do we focus on our side on bringing multi-sectoral responses? We've got our environment and our water, our agriculture colleagues all here. If we on our side can't come together to present a cohesive piece, how can we advocate that others need to do it? So we're trying to model on our side, how do we work together and to try and interface with government on these sorts of things. Some ideas.
Thank you. Effectively summarized in 5 minutes. Dr. Saab, can I please come back to you? And you are full of stories, so I'm going to give you 7 minutes, Ji. So my next question is, what regulatory measures exist to direct urban planning? How can the challenge of poor implementation, which stems from vested interests and lack of political will, be addressed? In light of these challenges, what is the likelihood of success of other nature-based solutions and interventions?
As far as urban planning is concerned, I'll be very honest and blunt with you. We have very weak regulatory measures. They come from an era in which cities were not a major challenge for us. So, you had the outline structure plans, which were basically land use plan plus sort of a thing. We were not looking at urban settlements very strategically. We were just looking at land use planning, having enough land for the next 20 years so you could house the expected population growth in households. And that was about, the end of it. And because we were not very disciplined about even that regulation sort of fell in disuse. But as human beings or as economies work, there has to be a real estate sector, there have to be housing developers and commercial developers. So they went their way and a haphazard sort of a development occurred. Now the challenge in the government right now is that we are trying to catch up institutionally with how to manage big cities. This is, I think, what our challenge is, at the moment. Because when I look at the existing regulatory mechanisms, they are not designed for the city the size of Lahore or the type of expectations or the type of goals or the objectives this city should have. These regulatory mechanisms were designed for a district level city, 1950s, 1960s, where there was a deputy commissioner and maximum population 100 to 200,000, that too very semi-rural. They were a bit of urbanized neighborhoods, so you could really manage it with simple type of regulations. What we've been trying to do is we've been trying to carry that same regulation into the 21st century and into Lahore. For example, let me give you an example. There is the National Reference Manual. They call it the NRM. That was made in 1987, which was basically a physical planning document for urban settlements. A 1987 manual is still being used to approve or to evaluate any type of local area plans. So, we ask for assistance from the World Bank in these things, that at least update ourselves. And as far as the issue of nature-based solutions is concerned, I think that is something that really needs a communication strategy attached to it. I think very few people know about it. Very few people even understand the potential of it, especially when it comes to water, that how effective can nature-based solutions be, but simply we are not aware of it. Why I'm saying this thing is that I'm very sanguine because I attended, again, my story of mandatory training with people who were 15 years younger to me, and because I went to do a PhD, so I'm catching up on my mandatory trainings. So they were 15 years younger to me. I think they are smarter. They simply do not have the right tools at the moment. They have not been sort of uh, told what to do. They've been trained on that same training pattern on which I was trained, and very much on which my father was trained. He too was also a civil servant. So I think what we really need is a better communication strategy within the government also, and we have to contextualize communication strategies with reference to different climatic challenges. We cannot have one broad communication strategy. That would be too confusing. And I'll stop with my story now, so I can cash on the 2 minutes that I've saved, and next time I'll speak for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. And I want to say that a lot of times you want to bring in new ideas, and like the newer generation does, but the government does not want to step outside its comfort zone. So it wants to stick to what we would do, what Pakistan has been doing generationally. But thank you. Ms. Amna, I'm coming back to you. Please do take a bit of the time allotted to talk about how sustainable agricultural practices can benefit small farmers. But the other question is also agri-supply chains are vulnerable to external shocks, which can cause considerable price fluctuations. How critical is it to ensure that there is stability across the supply chains? Thank you.
So the short answer is it's very critical. But let's talk detail now. So what are these price fluctuations? There are a range of external threats that cause price fluctuations in agri-supply chains. We've talked about natural disasters, climate change, pest outbreaks, but there's also input price volatility. Domestic policy, for example, if the government decides to increase your KIBOR rate, it reduces investment in your sectors, and agriculture is one of them. And also changing consumer demand or changing international requirements. Now the world is moving towards sustainably sourced foods. We are still working in a very conventional manner, growing our food with maximum use of resources which are less efficient. We don't care about health and safety, labor rights, and for example, in rice, which is considered a very good sector, exporting sector within Pakistan, there's a sustainable rice platform which is coming up with 41 standards that the world is committing to comply with. We have just not started looking at those yet. So a sector that is doing well today, we need to be wary of what the international requirements are and catch up with that and change ourselves. Now let's talk about how to hedge some of these price fluctuations. So one, data. I'll give you an example. So Punjab has an excellent farmer database. Punjab is the only province to have that. 5.5 million farmers of Punjab are digitized. And out of that, 75% of those farmers, the data is validated through the revenue department. This is excellent work, and this is what the government did. KP, Balochistan, and Sindh, they don't even have farmer data in a non-digitized manner. So you can only imagine how critical this is in order to plan for any policy. And also, we use this data. So the system in Punjab, it is now also modified to provide targeted subsidies to farmers. So there's the e-voucher system that you might have heard of. The government uses that system to provide subsidies on seed, certified seed, fertilizer, and pesticides. The rest of the country is far behind. We need to replicate that for that. Similarly, now we talk about moving towards targeted subsidies, but it's not that easy. However, we have modern tools to do that. One example is the government can align its subsidy programs with farmers who comply with climate smart practices and standards. So please go ahead, give your wheat support price, go ahead and provide subsidies on fertilizer, but give it to farmers who comply to a minimum range of standards. We can all agree to that and then start implementing. So this is one of the ways how we can do. Make use of data. The second use of data would be for real-time monitoring. Now, conventional surveillance system in pest identification is that a field officer will go to the farm, they will look at the pest, they will take photographs, then they will look at the manual, then they will report. This is labor intensive and prone to human error. The world has moved towards an ICT-based real-time pest data collection to accurately identify the pest, map the density, and then do response in a very timely manner. Early warning systems. Again, in order to have a robust early warning system mechanism, you need data. That we lack. Financial and legal systems. Now, these recommendations are primarily for the public sector. For the private sector, they also need to play a role. Financial systems. Now, the private sector, for example, the rice industry and the sugarcane industry, they go into long-term contracts with farmers, which is also called the contract farming. They expand backward linkages along the value chains. And this has been proven to work well because the farmers get a buyback guarantee that they will, whatever they produce, they will be able to sell very easily. So that's another option. You allow the private sector to expand on that. However, the government needs to regulate it so the private sector does not exploit farmers. And that's, again, the role of the government. Futures markets. Now, the futures markets, these are there to allow price risk hedging. We have very, very underdeveloped financial markets, and therefore futures we don't really hear much about. The key agriculture commodities that we grow, all of them are listed on the international futures market. So the government needs to increase awareness of the traders, of the farmers, and also improve linkages between these different stakeholders. Then the crop and livestock insurance. Now, insurance, again, is another tool to hedge price fluctuations. Again, this is very underdeveloped in Pakistan. I believe there's only one program under the World Bank that was initiated in the Punjab Agriculture Department, but it didn't really work well. So we need to learn from that and then look into how we can design better products for the farmers that can help them hedge not only the price risk, but also the yield loss risk. And lastly, storage options. So one of the issues that the farmers face is that, when it's time to harvest, they have no storage options. So they either store out in the open or they sell. If the private sector has a mechanism where they provide storage options, and again, Pakistan has started doing well in this. I'll give you an example. NRSP, this government NGO, they've set up warehouses where they store grains taken from smallholder farmers. In exchange, they offer them two things. One is the farmer can sell the produce and they will give him cash. The other is that if the farmer wants to store, they give them the warehouse gives them a receipt that can be used as collateral, and that can be used as cash to get cash from banks. Again, this has been proven to work. So we have local homegrown examples that are inclusive, that looks at the welfare of the farmer, and that can work. It's just that we need to reprioritize our finances, whatever little kitty we have, and then see what best options we can provide for our farmers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Amna. Those were a lot of very valid points, and I hope that the audience will ask you to probe more, to discuss them further. Thank you. Rafi, coming back to you. So Pakistan almost always relies on and shields itself from doing actual mitigation and adaptation work by saying that we don't emit enough. True, factually, definitely correct. We emit about 0.8%, less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But is that valid? Like, can you use that argument anymore? So I'm going to request Rafe to talk about, is it in the country's own interest to decarbonize the economy? What are some of the decarbonization options available in industry, power, and transport that also deliver local co-benefits? Basically, how can we get out of this stone age?
Thank you, Sarah. Pakistan is a low greenhouse gas emitter, therefore we sit on our hands, takes advantage of this principle of climate change law, the common but differentiated responsibilities, and I think takes advantage of it. Look, for a largely non-industrial economy, the fact that people are losing between 2 and 8 years of their lives on account of air pollution, and most air pollution is greenhouse gases, should be cause for concern and a rallying cry for action as it is. We don't need to have climate change to be able to sort of take action to save ourselves. The World Health Organization states that about 10 million people a year lose their lives on account of air pollution globally. But you have to put this into context. These 10 million per year are not sort of equally distributed around the world. They're heavily concentrated in cities, mostly in Asian and African countries. And that's us. That's us and our families and our friends who are a large proportion of those 10 million. So what I think we need is better climate governance. I know we have a climate policy and NDCs, but we have a federal climate policy that sort of approaches the problem from a cookie-cutter approach. It doesn't distinguish, for instance, between Balochistan, which has a coastal region, and KPK, which has the forests and the mountains, which are very differently impacted by climate change. Climate crisis is very locally felt, and so what I'm pushing towards or suggesting is that we need to have subnational approaches to climate governance. In our national determined contributions, where we talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40%, that's industrial emissions, that's transport emissions, and agricultural emissions. This is a federal policy, but these three sectors are all provincial departments, they're all provincial responsibilities, and there's no integration between the two. I know in the preparation of the revision to the NDC, which took place a couple of years ago, I was speaking to people in the industry department here in Punjab about what they were going to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And blank faces, because they had no idea what the UNFCCC or climate change was. And also the same is true with adaptation. Most adaptation in Punjab or in Pakistan has to do with water and how we can better provide against the flood challenges that we're going to see. And that largely is the responsibility of the irrigation department. And the irrigation department really doesn't, in Punjab, I can tell you, doesn't really have a plan. I do want to, short story here, because I was speaking to people from the irrigation department last year. And they were telling me that because of the heat wave, which started in March, farmers started watering their crops or needed to water their crops earlier than usual. Usually the summer comes late April, early May, by which time there's enough precipitation and glacial melt so that there's water in the rivers and in the systems, and sufficient amount of juggling can be done by the irrigation department so that farmers have enough water to do this. But when the heat hit in March, there was no water in Punjab for 2 weeks. I'll repeat that. no water in Punjab, which gets its name from water. And that's the present status of the climate crisis over here. Now, Punjab might have changed the nomenclature of the department, but it doesn't have a climate plan as yet. KP and Sindh have put together a climate action plan, but their departments, along with the Punjab department, desperately need better capacity. Environment protection departments with a climate change add-on, like you have in Sindh, you had the Environment and Coastal Development Department, is now the Environment, Coastal Development and Climate Change Department. You have to understand that these EPDs focus largely on industrial pollution control, and they don't really have the capacity to understand what climate governance or what sub-national climate governance is, how these reductions in greenhouse gases in the industry, transport, and agriculture departments have to be intertwined. And perhaps that's an area where CDPR can intervene in and help these departments enhance their capacities to better appreciate the sub-national or the local implications of the climate crisis. Now, when it comes to capacity, our departments historically are sometimes accidents. I'm reminded by Dr. Umar's training, how it was, similar to what your father also went through, sir. But I did a study for the Ministry of Climate Change a few years ago. And the Ministry of Climate Change, before it was the Ministry of Climate Change, was the Ministry of Environment, it started off as a division in the Ministry of Housing and Works in 1979. And I've mentioned this story to you. So it started off as a division in the Ministry of Housing and Works because the federal government sort of manpower layout was best suited through the Ministry of Housing and Works because its cities are where most industry are, and Housing and Works had sort of men or women stationed in the big cities to be able to do the industrial pollution control. Anyway, long story short, historical accident, as a result of the Ministry of Environment starting from a division in the Ministry of Housing and Works, the service rules of the Ministry of Climate Change today still require that the educational qualifications of the Director General Climate Change today are a PhD in urban planning. So again, there is a huge need to improve the capacity, not just of the Ministry of Climate Change, but especially the provincial departments, so that they can appreciate the sub-national implications of the climate crisis with greater nuance. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafi. Fascinating. Mr. John Roome, I'm coming back to you for your second question, please. So you spoke earlier about sharing international experiences and how Pakistan can benefit from them. So what do you think are the potential policy and institutional reforms? And what are some good examples from other countries that Pakistan could learn from? And what are key enablers for the change? And I guess we should focus on countries that are in the global south. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. So my sense is that there are out there, in a number of areas, examples of countries that have done good things, and I'll talk about some of those examples. I'm not sure that anybody has got everything right, and I'm not sure you can just take a blueprint and somehow think you can apply it. And there are also lots of examples of bad things that you can do. I think clearly Pakistan needs to look to comparable countries, but it can also look to things in the global north that it can do as well. So I wouldn't be too fussy. But let me just talk about a few examples which I think are particularly relevant. One is a systemic response to resilience. State of Kerala in India, they had a bunch of floods about 5 years ago now, and the immediate response was, let's focus on what the costs were and just build it back. And then they thought about it a little bit, and we had some discussions with them, and they said, well, why don't we build a resilient Kerala initiative that focuses as much on building that resilience in a systemic way? And so coming from the chief minister down, chief secretary, they created an institution that was focused on this. They brought the different departments together. They put a plan together. They had sub-programs that started on the most important resilience things. And then over time, it has morphed so that they've added additional. In the first round, agriculture wasn't in it. Then they added agriculture in. Solid waste wasn't in. They added solid waste in. It was focused entirely on resilience to start with. Now they've added in a green growth pillar to it. And so they've been able to pull the different parts of the institution together and been very open to bring in different parts of civil society, private sector, in a very deliberate way to create institutions to try and deliver this. That's example number one. Example number two is how do you bring together different views and different people to get a coherent view of what's happening. Two examples I would think there. One is from Nepal and one is from South Africa. Nepal has introduced what they call the GRID framework, Green, Resilient, Inclusive Development. And they've worked across ministries so that this is now the language and the philosophy and the approach that they have. You talk to any of the ministers in the NFSA, they talk about it. They're now moving that to a strategic action plan that implements it. They've got 10 transitions that spell it out. They talk about what it means for watershed, what it means for urban, and they're spelling this out and driving it. And they've managed to get all of the development partners to commit to align to this grid, and all the development partners have signed a declaration, the Kathmandu Declaration, that says they will align their development support with this. South Africa, a slightly different issue, because they've got a set of just transition challenges, particularly around the coal mining sector. And the question is then, you've got unions at odds with business, at odds with government. How do you deal with it? They created an independent presidential climate change commission whose objective was to create fora for discussion amongst these different industries. They're not a policy decision maker. They're in a sort of a facilitating, enabling advisory role that creates this forum within which people can discuss these sorts of topics. Final comment, I'm not going to go into a lot of it, but any one of the topics that we've talked about, you can go to an international. You want to talk about reducing your fertility rate. Look at what Bangladesh did. Okay, it wasn't just family planning. It was opportunities for girls, education for girls, payments if you stay in school. You keep girls in school for another 2 years. They marry later, they get jobs, and the fertility rate goes down. Okay, it's not just about distributing contraception. Okay, you look at the Loess Plateau in China about rebuilding resilient landscapes. If you want to look at carbon taxes, look at what British Columbia did. They put in place a carbon tax in a natural resource-based economy, but they reduced income taxes in proportion. And if you're poor, when you go to the gas station, if you're poor, you get your rebate. So they made it focusing so the poor are not impacted. They reduced the impact on taxes, so it's not a tax increase, but they shifted the burden into something else. And they had a clear communications campaign. We can go through all of these sorts of things. We can look at the light bulbs that they introduced in India through bulk public procurement. They managed to reduce the cost of a light bulb, LED light bulb, from $5 each to about 15 cents each, and distributed 20 million electric light bulbs. They're doing the same thing with leasing of electric buses. So it's not a lot of people talk about buying electric buses. They created a business model to lease electric buses. So there's lots of the balance of taking global knowledge and experience and then adapting to it locally.
Thank you, Mr. Roome. I hope Pakistan will benefit immensely from the examples that other countries have used. Before we move on to the question and answer session, I want to invite Dr. Nabi to speak again. He would like to take a few minutes to address the audience and the panelists. Thank you.
Okay. Fantastic. Fortunately, the technology helped. Hear everything. So even though I got use the laptop to actually coordinate the voice with the image, but that's okay. I just want to address two issues. One is somebody said, how much money can the World Bank bring to help us meet all of these expenditures? The World Bank, I don't know what the annual lending targets are now maybe $2 to $3 billion a year. Um, uh, Pakistani is working overseas, remit $30 billion a year. It's not the lack of money, it's what we do with that money that's so important. Because of our poor savings rate and very high consumption rate, all of those remittances get converted into imports and lands us back in the problem of balance of payment crisis instead of this money being utilized for productive purposes. So what we need the bank for is not so much money, it's for global ideas. What John just talked about, picking up ideas. The World Bank does a terrific job of keeping track of who's doing what in
Maximum. Please keep your questions short. Address them to the specific panelists that you'd like them to. And let's say, keep the answers to about 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
मैं प्लीज सर ऑफिस से क्वेश्चन है thank you so much for informing us. Can you please tell us, like, how can the youth and the upcoming professionals can be engaged in the better climate governance?
You need to be in the room. The room specifically is called the National Climate Change Council, and the only way to do that is to have a forum of your own that's connected throughout Pakistan, so that when you go to the ministry, you can say you represent voices of the youth from all 4 provinces, and I myself will help you lobby for a seat at that council.
Great. Who's next? Okay, you and then Firaq. Ji.
Pertaining that government is not fully functional or not working rightly so. But I want to ask, what should be the collaborating mechanism you can propose that all the relevant department may come under such mechanism to function properly? Just I would like to example the corona epidemic disease, how we handle that disease, and got out of it. So would you think that mechanism like that would be effective or not?
बहुत
Anyone would
शुक्रिया
like?
जी डॉक्टर उमर आप would you like to take this question? Thank you.
Oh, yes, I would. I would love to take this question. Uh, uh, the example which you gave of COVID is exactly that you start thinking for yourself. I would be dead honest with you that our response to COVID was 100% indigenous in the first 2 months. How we did it was basically that people started talking to each other. And what John's remark about examples from the south were is that we can think about a structure, we can formulate a structure, but we need to start talking to each other, and the structure would eventually evolve. So initially, the COVID structure was daily meetings headed by the chief secretary with key identified people who they thought that were very effective as far as the response was concerned. Then over a period of time, this thing evolves. It develops a workflow, and then there is a pattern to it, and then there is a convention to it, and now we have a COVID response system which evolved. Our problem is, and I'm not trying to sort of shift the blame on the bank or anything else, is that our bandwidth as development professionals in the public sector so much occupied by the multilaterals and their templates. Not that their templates are wrong. It is sometimes this impression that John has just visited Lahore. We got a tick box against the Punjab Affordable Housing Program. We must be doing something right. And the whole idea is that now there are fewer and fewer conversations, really, that here is a program or here is something that we are doing it this way. Can we improve it further? You know, we've stopped sort of conversing in that manner in terms of improving what we are already doing. And I think we've sort of become victim to our processes, our bureaucratic processes, number one. Uh, there is a history also now, very recent history of accountability witch hunts, which sort of has prevented people from experimenting also. I mean, I do not wish for another COVID type episode for us to come up with another out of box solutions. So, what I would advise the government to do is to create space, enough space so that people can actually discuss and introspect how they are doing. And in that, our partners, as far as the bank is concerned, they can also come and just talk about openly that uh, is there a better way to design future programs, or better way of interventions. But I strongly believe that there is, and I've been a civil servant for now 20 odd years. I strongly believe that that type of a conversation has sort of died down. My sort of own hypothesis is this thing. The face-to-face conversation was always a very good tool where you could really vent out what your true feeling is. I cannot vent out what my true feeling is over a WhatsApp message. I can send an emoji or I can send the tears rolling down my cheek, but that is, if that's what the development discourse is coming to, that's not a happy place to be. And one more thing, this is my third time around. So next time around, do invite a different civil servant, that so you actually have a different flavor, because civil service is not plain vanilla. I can assure you that. It's very exotic. It's simply that you don't have our numbers. You just have my number. So you really need to improve upon your sort of contacts list. Um, uh, and I think it's all about thinking and talking to each other, and having enough space and enough confidence to suggest improvements, or to I quote an example from Africa. Somebody told me about that. In Uganda, I think it was Museveni or something. When he sort of bought his reform, he was a university professor before he joined politics. So he used to ask everybody that you write a two-pager, and only then I'm going to actually consider that proposal. So this, even the art of writing, for example, the art of of conversation has sort of died down, and we have sort of become victim to checklists. And I think checklists are good if you have a good plan. It keeps you more disciplined. But when you are confronting a dynamic problem like climate change, you really need to keep thinking again and again that do we need to change course? Do we need to change the communication strategy? As far as cities are concerned, is land use planning the real problem, or is there something else? Perhaps it's water, or perhaps it's the building codes, for example. All these things we really need to talk uh, much more and sort of archive these things either as case studies or as reports or something like that. I don't want to sound bureaucratic because it looks like being bureaucratic, but I think there is much more that we need to do, and it's all within ourselves. We can't ask the bank to do the thinking for us, although the bank is doing it for most of the time. But we really need to sort of up our game on this one.
So just a quick two-hander on that. It was Godfrey Tumasimi, who was the finance minister in Uganda, that did this. And the interesting thing, though, is that this two-pager wasn't the only thing that he did, but through a series of mechanisms, he oversaw a period of very effective reform, particularly on poverty, integration of different things, but through a very deliberate set of mechanisms of bringing together his different ministries through the way in which he allocated finance, the way in which he screened the budget, the way in which he indicated with the development partners. So there are techniques that you can use to pull this together, but it doesn't have to be the same way, cookie cutter in every country. You've got to adapt it to your local culture and bureaucracy.
Thank you. The last question, please. Ji.
Hi, my name is Janet Bazari. I'm actually a farmer from Rajan, so my question is Assalamu alaikum. My name is Janat Mazari and I'm a farmer from Rajanpur. So my question is for Ms. Bajwa actually. Is there anything that's being done to bridge the gap between resources and centers like CDPR or PARC and the farmer on ground? Like tenant farmers that work under us who don't believe in climate change, who don't have the basic tools or the equipment to be able to figure out कि crop rotation कैसे करनी है, mulching क्या होती है, organic farming क्या चीज़ है. So since they are like 70 or 80% of your agricultural workers are uneducated, like what resources do I have at my disposal to try and tell them what to do and how to combat all these issues that we're having? Because I don't see a way out, to be honest.
Great, thank you. And I'm so glad you asked that question. And also, Amna, if you could talk about how women specifically can benefit from some initiatives.
Okay, thank you. So I'll come to your question later. First, I'll answer Ms. Mazari's question. So at the federal level, there's not much initiative when you talk about climate smart agriculture practices. However, profitability drives farmers. With the rising input costs, climate smart agriculture or regenerative agriculture is the way forward. Why? Because it requires less use of water, less use of pesticide, and less use of fertilizer. Fertilizer price has doubled in the last year. So profitability drives farmers, and we've seen that regenerative agriculture is being adopted by farmers across Punjab at least very rapidly. Now, what I would expect the government to do, which they are not currently doing, I'll give you an example. In order to have, for example, this nature-based or regenerative agriculture, you need to prepare land in a certain way. You don't till. For that, you need a raised bed maker. Now, the NARC is developing that. But when they tested it in the fields, it did not work very well. Similarly, they designed a precision planter. So this is on their radar, but right now you don't see it in practice. But we are hoping, I'm based in Islamabad, I also consult for the federal government. We are pushing for this. So we're hoping in some time we will sort of bring these under PSDP projects within the government. Second part, extension. Extension service is very, very critical. So within extension, not only just advisory through ICT or otherwise, but also demonstration. that will really prove whether, or for you and me as well, until we see something, we don't adopt. Now for women.
Sorry, I can answer this question.
Sure.
I'm from so we are having trainings over there with the farmers, with the local farmers. So in which we are telling them the techniques, the smart techniques, where you can grow the early sowing and the seed selections or the irrigation like kind of things. So we do that on our level. If you specifically ask about Rajhan, which is, yeah, that's why due to security reasons, we didn't visit that area that much. But the rest of the Rajanpur, we do that. Thank you.
So I.
Okay, I'm just going to ask Amna to quickly talk in 2 minutes about how women can benefit specifically from sustainable agricultural practices.
Yes, completely agreed. So currently, women, unfortunately, in Pakistan, they're very much part of agriculture. Within the workforce employed in agriculture, 70% of them are women. So, but unfortunately, they are the ones providing low value input. So, for example, seed cleaning at home is done by women, not paid. They are not paid for it. They are not trained for it. Seed is a critical factor when you talk about agriculture yields. So you train them and you can immediately see the yield effect within a season. Rice transplantation, extremely difficult manual labor that women do while standing in water, exposing themselves to snakes also, So unfortunately, women right now are playing, they are in the lower end of the value within the agriculture. Tremendous potential though. I'll talk about livestock. We do understand the cultural limitations of our country, especially in provinces like KP and Balochistan. However, even there, women manage livestock. And livestock contributes more to our GDP than crops. You can bring women into processing of agriculture livestock products by increasing their training, their awareness, basic provision of toolkits, for example, on how to make jam or how to make ghee or yogurt and sell in the local community. This is being done at very small scale, but we need to sort of expand that to bring women, empower them, and include them financially. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amna. Thank you for that, summarizing it. I am going to not take much of your time. I'm just going to thank the panelists profusely for sharing their knowledge and expertise. We all learned a lot from you. Thank you for your time. I want to thank the organizers for putting together this event. This has been wonderful. We've all learned a lot. And in the end, I'll just say, like Dr. Saab said, climate change is constantly evolving. Its solutions need to be constantly evolving. We need to constantly learn from each other, from best practices internationally. We need to be open to accepting that climate change is a crisis now. It was a problem yesterday, it's a crisis today, and that we need solutions at the ready now. And I hope that we will all do our part in helping each other, the country, and this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.